At 04:14 hours, local time from a secret launch site in Odessa, 12 Ukrainian FP-02 UAVs left their launchers simultaneously and raced straight towards Saki military airfield in western Crimea. After a series of Ukrainian attacks aimed at encircling and isolating Crimea, Russia had just sent an additional squadron of Su-30 fighters to Saki to strengthen air defense and support the entire peninsula. When the formation was still 40 miles from the target, an S-400 Triumph missile battery in Olenivka detected them immediately. On the radar screen, the Russian operator saw 12 small signals entering the engagement zone. What made him confident was the numbers. 32 missiles against 12 cheap drones, a completely uneven ratio. The Ukrainians knew this, and they were not playing by probability. They had another carefully prepared plan. The first group of 3 UAVs suddenly broke away from the formation and climbed higher. Their internal combustion engines were pushed to maximum power. An electromagnetic screech immediately swept across the sky, lighting up Russian radar screens within a 15-mile radius. And that was exactly what Ukraine wanted. The first 3 UAVs had been sent forward to pull the entire Russian air defense system toward themselves. Like a magician, the thing they want you to look at first is never the real strike. What appears afterward is what surprises you and deceives you. 30 seconds later, the next group of 3 FP-02s broke away from the formation over the central Black Sea, dropping low to skim the sea surface at 250 sea feet. Their thermal cameras turned the dark sea into a gray picture of heat and cold. Behind them, the final 2 groups continued keeping their distance. Their engines were already hot. Their guidance systems had already locked onto the flight route, but they were not rushing in yet. Everything was running according to a timer programmed weeks earlier by people who understood one thing very clearly. An air defense system, just like a human being, can only focus on a limited number of threats at the same time. At this moment, the S-400 battery commander faced a harder problem. Each drone was worth $70,000, while each of his missiles was worth $2 million, a completely uneven exchange. On paper, the S-400 still had enough firepower to shoot them down easily. But Ukraine had another bold plan. They only needed Russian radar to be stretched thin, the combat crew to be forced into choosing the wrong priority, and the gate into Saki to open for a few short minutes. And that was enough time for each UAV group to move in a different direction. The northern group, made up of 3 FP-02s, began acting first. They climbed to 2,000 feet, amplified their signals, then accelerated to 120 miles per hour, as if they were about to dive into the target. On the S-400 radar screen, these 3 bright points stood out more than anything else. Clear enough to draw attention, fast enough to feel dangerous, and obvious enough to force the Russian combat crew to react. The middle group kept a much colder flight pattern. 3 UAVs maintained an altitude of 350 feet, holding a straight line towards Saki airfield. They flew as if they did not care that they had already been detected. To the south, the third group began its part of the plan. They curved deep into the central Black Sea, stretching their flight path away from the Crimean Peninsula, away from Saki, away from every obvious military target. To a radar crew under pressure, that direction looked almost irrational. Maybe they were moving to attack a different target. Ukraine understood Russia's dense, modern air defense weapons too well. They always had a plan detailed and safe enough. The remaining group of 3 FP-02s dropped to only 100 feet above the sea surface, reduced speed to the minimum, and kept their distance from the entire formation ahead. They quietly slid over the water, turning wave reflection clutter into their own natural cover. This was the reserve group. If the middle group was destroyed, they would immediately become the main attack group. If the S-400 poured missiles into the northern group, they would gain more time to close in. If Saki's air defense called for support or moved in additional interceptors, they would cut off that support before it could form a new defensive layer. The S-400 launcher turned north and raised its launch angle. On the control screen, the 3 northern FP-02s were the clearest targets. They were almost turning themselves into the easiest answer for the Russian combat crew. The order to fire was given. 3 9M96-2 missiles left their launch tubes, pulling columns of white flame into the Crimean sky. During the first 6 seconds, they flew according to correction commands from the S-400's gravestone radar: climb, hold course, adjust slightly left, accelerate to Mach 3, and close the distance. Inside each missile was a small guidance processor continuously calculating the interception angle, measuring closing speed, comparing target altitude, and predicting the next position of the northern group moving ahead. The SSU Alpha Special Forces team had been waiting for exactly this moment. As the missiles entered their terminal phase, the active radar seeker in the nose of each missile began operating. The X-band radar scanned straight into the airspace ahead, emitting dense pulses of energy to find the target on its own. As soon as the radar warning receivers on the FP-02 group detected the signal shifting from ground radar tracking to missile seeker lock, all three UAVs immediately changed course. They made a sharp dive down toward the sea surface, trading away all the altitude they had just gained to pull the missiles out of their original interception solution. Only seconds earlier, the missile computers had been calculating a meeting point with a high target. Now, the target had suddenly dropped at a 60 degrees angle. The three missiles tried to follow. Their control surfaces adjusted continuously in the high-speed airflow. But the problem was not only the flight angle. The problem was that below them there was no longer a clean sky. There was the sea. Waves, moisture, white foam, and chaotic reflective patches began bouncing radar energy back into the seekers. The Doppler filters tried to distinguish the real UAVs from background clutter. But, at extreme speed, the missiles had too little time to read it all. It was like trying to find a small bird in a storm while you yourself were flying through that storm at the speed of a bullet at 100 feet above the sea surface. The three FP-02s stabilized their flight path. They only needed to make the radar seekers lose a clear picture of the target. A few seconds later, all three missiles lost lock. The onboard computers could no longer confirm a valid target ahead. The self-destruct mechanism activated, and two small explosions flashed above the sea surface. After that failed interception, the Russian air defense crew shifted its attention to the third group in the south. There was only one problem. That group had disappeared. Not disappeared from the sky, but on the S-400 radar screen, the three southern signals suddenly faded, broke apart, and dropped out of tracking as if they had been swallowed by the Black Sea. They had done something simple, but extremely irritating. They had flown deeper into the central Black Sea, pulling themselves away from the main surveillance axis around Crimea. For the 991 N6E long-range surveillance radar, a high-flying target could be detected within a range of 280 miles. But a small UAV flying only 100 feet above the sea surface was a completely different problem. The radar horizon dropped lower, reflection clutter from the water increased sharply, and the radar cross-section of an FP-02 was far smaller than that of a manned aircraft. 3 feet waves, salty moisture, an 18-knot crosswind and a low reflection angle turned each UAV into a dot that appeared and vanished. At a speed of around 100 miles per hour, losing track for only 20 seconds meant each FP-02 had already traveled almost 0.5 miles farther out at sea. The Russian commander immediately called the S-400 Triumph battery in the Sevastopol port area. A few seconds later, another 991 N6E radar was brought into an expanded sweep toward the Black Sea, using a 12 degrees angle search mode to filter small targets flying close to the water surface. The phased array antenna began scanning in arcs, rebuilding the target picture from weak and broken signals. Then the three signals appeared again. Small, low, but real. On the new screen, the southern UAV group had not fled. They'd only stretched their flight path far enough for the first battery to lose them, while still remaining inside a safe fuel margin. The three FP-02s held an altitude of 100 feet above the sea surface, low enough to blend into background clutter, but still high enough to avoid large waves and the airflow close to the water. And right at that moment, they began turning back. This was the most dangerous part of the flight path. Turn 2 minutes too early, and they would reveal their intent and be reacquired by Saki's radar too soon. Turn 2 minutes too late, and they might not have enough fuel left for the final acceleration phase and the dive onto Saki military airfield. The flight controller had to calculate continuously. Crosswind, remaining fuel, distance to Crimea, the new approach angle, turning radius, and safe altitude. At more than 100 miles per hour, even a turn that was 20 to 25 degrees off was enough to push the UAV hundreds of feet away from its flight path. Drift too far south and they would die at sea. Move too close to Crimea and they would light up on radar like a neon sign. But for Ukrainian UAV crews, this kind of calculation had become part of war over the past 3 years. To them, This was just another normal day at work. If you have ever seen a flock of birds break formation just before a storm, then you understand what is happening here. Each one flies in a different direction. Not because of chaos, but because the entire flock is forcing the predator to choose the wrong target. And at this moment, the Russian air defense crew is falling directly into that situation. While the battery commander is still being pulled between two problems at once, the northern group has just caused two interceptor missiles to fail. While the southern group has disappeared and then reappeared over the Black Sea, the middle group begins facing problems of its own. 3-9M96E missiles leave the S-400 launch tubes. They are programmed to intercept low-flying targets from the very beginning. Maintaining a flatter flight path and accelerating straight toward the FP-02 group, advancing in the direction of Saki airfield. The 981N6E radar has learned from the first mistake. It wants to lock onto them before they have a chance to do it. 3 FP-02s climb to around 1,200 feet, push their engines to full power, and accelerate directly toward the launcher. They are charging straight at the S-400 battery. The first FP-02 is locked immediately. An interceptor missile races toward it, its seeker catching a clear signal against the open sky, and the first UAV disappears in a small burst of fire. For the S-400 crew, it is a clean kill. One target eliminated. Two more are still coming in. The second drone immediately accelerates again, keeping its course straight toward the S-400 battery, as if it is the main strike vehicle. The radar locks onto it. The second missile shifts its trajectory, chasing the target as it closes in at increasing speed. The guidance computer has to recalculate constantly because the target is not flying away from the launcher like a normal UAV. It is flying back toward the very place the missile was launched from. And that is the problem. Every air defense system has dead zone at close range, where a missile no longer has enough time to turn, activate its warhead, and intercept safely. For a weapon designed to destroy aircraft, cruise missiles, and targets at long range, a small UAV rushing inside the defensive envelope is like a shorter fighter, closing in and clinching an opponent with a longer reach. All the advantages of range begin to become useless. While the second drone pulls all attention toward itself, the third FP-02 does the opposite. It drops back down to 300 feet, reduces its signature, and drifts away from the direct attack line, as if it has abandoned the strike. On the Russian radar, it looks like a secondary target, and the S-400 crew believes it. The missile continues locking onto the second drone. Its control surfaces adjust sharply, trying to find an intercept point before the UAV crosses into dangerously close range. But the more it follows, the closer it moves toward its own launch position. Safety procedures begin to intervene. No missile is allowed to continue its flight if the risk of endangering the launch battery becomes too high. That amount of time is enough. The third FP-02, which seemed to have given up, suddenly opens its throttle at 300 feet. It flies lower, faster, and cuts into the approaching angle the radar has just ignored. For a few brief seconds, the entire S-400 battery is looking at the second UAV, while the third has become the real threat. Then it dives. It only needs to be in the right place at the right moment when the air defense system is being forced to process too many decisions at once. The FP-02 slams directly into the area of the S-400 battery. Its Su-30 ALB warhead detonates. The explosion tears open the night near the launcher. Fire erupts from the Russian air defense position, the same place that only minutes earlier was believed to be the shield protecting Saki airfield. The three UAVs did not defeat the S-400 through power. They defeated it through sacrifice and the creative strike plan of the Ukrainian control team. The problem is that Russia did not deploy only one S-400 battery around Saki. Crimea is a multi-layered air defense network, and the remaining 9 FP-2 are about to discover that for themselves. At near 4 p.35 hours local time, the Ukrainian UAV formation enters western Crimean airspace. At Mirny, a Russian S-400 Vityaz battery has already been tracking them for 4 minutes, detecting their signatures through its NCT multifunction radar. This is a prepared air defense position placed within Crimea's protective layers with a combat crew that has years of experience dealing with low-flying UAVs. 4-9 SAM-96 interceptor missiles leave the launchers in quick succession. But there is something different about the way they come in. They do not climb in a high arc before diving down. They hold a lower, flatter trajectory, accelerating horizontally through the night like white spears aimed directly at the FP-02 group flying close to the terrain. The S-350 does not simply fire and wait for the result. During the approach phase, the missiles chase their targets while also sending radar data and lock-on information back to the ground battery. In simple terms, each missile becomes a flying eye out in front, helping the system see farther than the ground radar can through uneven terrain and the curve of the coastline. It is both predator and scout. The first two FP-02s do not have enough time to prepare. They are still holding their old formation when the warning signals spike. One missile catches the lead drone before it can drop altitude. The UAV bursts apart in a small flash of fire. The second tries to bank sharply to the right, but it is too late. The proximity warhead detonates right beside it, tearing the UAV's body into pieces of carbon fiber that fall into the darkness below. The 7 remaining drones immediately understand the problem. If they continue flying across open terrain, they will be picked off one by one. The lead UAV of the surviving group drops lower, trading altitude for speed, then pulls the entire formation into a narrow ravine near the coastal mountain range. This is not a graceful evasive maneuver. It is a forced dive into cover, where a deviation of only a few meters could send them into the rock face before the missiles even have the chance to do it. The rolling coastal mountains become a natural shield for the ground radar. The slopes create short blind zones. For the missile seekers, the cliffs, the ground, and the cold moisture inside the ravine create a chaotic picture of reflections. The 2 remaining missiles try to stay locked on. They dive after the UAV group, their seekers still searching for targets inside the narrow space. But air defense missiles were not designed to chase small targets sliding along rock walls. A tiny shift in viewing angle is enough to turn the UAVs, rocks, dust, and ground background into overlapping signals. Then, the proximity fuse triggers too early. The first missile explodes beside the cliff face, throwing dust and stone fragments into the air. The second flies several hundred meters deeper, loses its tracking angle, and slams into the mountainside in a blinding explosion. The shockwave rolls through the ravine like an iron door being slammed shut. For a few seconds, the Russian radar screen shows only interference. Smoke and dust cover the flight path, but then from the other side of the smoke, 7 small signals appear again. Lower, more scattered, but still moving. These 7 remaining FP-02s continue flying towards Saki. They are no longer flying in a simple formation. Instead, they are coming from 3 different directions, as if they are slowly closing a ring around the target. For the S-350 crew at Mirny, this is no longer a normal interception. It is a problem changing second by second. In theory, the S-350 VTS can track multiple targets at the same time, react extremely quickly, and intercept low-flying targets far more effectively than many older systems. But the problem is that the FP-02s are not flying the way Russian air defense crews are usually trained to handle. They do not hold formation, and they refuse to stay still inside the algorithm. As they approach the protective zone around Saki airfield, the UAV groups begin switching positions with one another. Their flight paths cross and trade places. One drone from the north cuts across the path of the one in the middle. Another drops lower and slides underneath. A third pulls up to 200 feet, creating a signal intersection right in front of the Russian radar. In that moment, the radar returns merge into one small block of interference, then separate again. The S-350's computer tries to maintain each flight path separately. Which UAV was just on the left? Which one just dropped lower? Which signal is the old target and which one is the new one? Each recalculation takes only 2 seconds. But when multiple UAVs are constantly switching positions, 2 seconds is no longer fast. It becomes a gap. And in air defense, gap is the target's life. The Russian crew switches to the next option, illuminating the target and using the electro-optical system for confirmation. On paper, this is a very reliable backup layer. If the radar is jammed or loses target separation, optical cameras and thermal imaging can help the combat crew see what the radar can no longer clearly understand. But it is still before dawn. The sky is dark. Morning mist hangs low over the coastal area. The ground is cold, the sea is cold, and the small UAV bodies appear only as weak, blurry heat traces sliding across a gray background of rock, grass, concrete, and vapor. The electro-optical system cannot clearly distinguish what is a real UAV, what is a heat shadow, and what is interference from the surrounding environment. The S-350 has not been destroyed. It has simply been forced into a situation where every choice is too slow. If it keeps firing, the risk of locking onto the wrong target is too high. If it waits for confirmation, the UAVs will push deeper into the Saki zone. If it switches back to radar, the signals are still crossing, merging, and separating again and again. In the end, the battery is forced to stop attacking. Over the radio, the Russian commander reports that they have shot down 2 UAVs. That is true, but it does not change the outcome. These 7 remaining FP-02s have still passed through the S-350 interception layer and are still flying from multiple directions towards Saki airfield. In military language, the report may call it partial destruction of the target formation. But in reality, its meaning is much simpler. They shot down 2 and still failed. Data on the UAV swarm is quickly transmitted to the Panzer S-1 unit on combat duty inside the airfield's defensive perimeter. This is Russia's short to medium range, self-propelled, surface-to-air missile and anti-aircraft artillery system. Usually used to protect high-value targets such as airbases, radar sites, fuel depots, and command posts. The Panzer's 1RS-11E target acquisition radar begins scanning the northwest sector of the airfield. The antenna spins rapidly, rebuilding the low-altitude air picture. Only a few seconds later, 7 small signals appear on the screen. Speed 110 miles per hour, altitude 400 feet, distance 30 miles, and closing fast. The data is immediately transferred to the 1RS-21E fire control radar. It does not merely see the targets. It calculates firing angle, closing speed, altitude, flight direction, and the projected interception point. Within seconds, the system identifies 3 different approach axes. The first FP-02 group is heading directly toward the end of the runway, where Russian aircraft could still attempt an emergency take-off if there is enough time. The second group veers toward the parking aprons and hangars, where a squadron of Su-30s has just been sent to reinforce Crimea's air defense. The third group flies along the outer edge, 100 feet lower than the other 2 groups, angling toward the defensive flank, as if it is only a secondary target. For the Panzer crew, this is exactly the kind of situation they have been trained to handle. 2 57E6 missiles are selected in advance. Each missile is 10 feet long, weighs 150 pounds, reaches speeds above Mach 2, and is designed to intercept low-flying targets before they can get too close. The launch order is given. 2 launch tubes flash and 2 white streaks of fire shoot away from the combat vehicle. The first missile locks onto the lead FP-02. Within seconds, its proximity warhead detonates 15 feet from the UAV's body, tearing it into a cloud of small fragments that fall into the empty ground outside their field. The second missile chases the FP-02, heading toward the parking area. The UAV tries to bank sharply and drop another 65 feet to blend into the dark ground below. But at this range, it does not have enough time. The second explosion flashes through the pre-dawn mist. The second FP-02 disappears from the radar screen. The distance is now just over 1 mile. At that range, missiles are no longer the best option. The targets are flying low near the edge of the engagement zone and constantly changing their approach angles. If more missiles are fired, the risk that they will fail to guide properly or enter the area too close to the airfield becomes too high. The crew chief orders a switch to guns. The Panzer's 2 A38M automatic cannons begin firing. Their combined rate of fire reaches up to 5,000 rounds per minute. They create a wall of metal in front of the airfield, a dense curtain of fire, thick enough to tear apart any UAV that flies straight into it. The low sky in front of Saki instantly lights up with orange streaks. 30mm rounds cut through the mist, crackling across the approach path. From the ground, it looks like a burning net being stretched across the front of the base. The FP-02 on the outer flank drops even lower, slides toward the outer edge of the gunfire zone, then curves in a wide arc behind the main firing direction. It has been flying on the far edge to create an escape angle away from the gun axis. When the 2 lead drones are shot down, the Panzer is forced to focus its cannons toward the front of the airfield. And at that exact moment, the third drone disappears from the place where the Russian crew expects it to appear. The 1RS-21E radar tries to swing back and catch the target. The turret begins adjusting direction, but a combat vehicle does not turn like a handheld camera. It needs time to shift its firing axis, stabilize the sightline, and bring the target back into the center of the kill zone. A delay of only a few seconds is enough. The FP-02 suddenly opens its throttle. It races straight toward the Panzer S-1. At a distance of half a mile, the entire advantage of the air defense system begins to shrink. The radar can see the target, but seeing it is no longer the same as firing in time. The guns can turn, but they cannot turn fast enough to fully cover the new angle. The Russian crew has only a few seconds. A final burst of 30mm rounds shoots too high. The aiming point slips behind the UAV. The body of the FP-02 shakes in the turbulent air, but it holds its course. Its nose camera now sees only the air defense vehicle growing larger in the frame. The turret, the radar cluster, the launch tubes, and the vehicle hull sitting near the edge of the airfield. Then impact comes. The FP-02 warhead detonates beside the hole in combat equipment section of the Panzer. The blast wave slams into the radar compartment, damaging the sensor cluster and fire control system. The twin 30mm cannons fall silent. The 1RS-11E acquisition radar loses stable signal. The 1RS-21E fire control radar disappears from the control screen like an eye that has just been blinded. The final defensive layer before Saki airfield is torn open. The gate into Saki base is wide open. There is no longer a fire control radar close enough to lock onto the final targets. Russian soldiers on the ground can only raise their AK-12s and fire wildly into the sky. It is a desperate reflex. Inside the command room, the Russian officer shouts into the radio, "Call the fire crews. Call reinforcements. Send another quick reaction team to the parking area." But those orders come too late. The Panzer S-100 has been removed from the battle at the most critical moment, and the remaining FP-02s are only seconds away from the target area. Saki is no longer protected like an airbase. It is only a target waiting for the final strike. The final strike came immediately after that. As the Panzer S-1 burned at the edge of the airfield, the 5 remaining FP-02s raced into the hangar area of Saki Air Base. This is where Russia had concentrated Су-30 SM, Су-30, and Су-24 aircraft, along with fuel trucks, maintenance equipment, and supply depots, serving the squadron that had just been sent to Crimea. The objective was to make the entire squadron unable to take off. The first FP-02 dived into the northern hangar row at an angle of about 40 degrees with an impact speed of more than 150 miles per hour. Its warhead punched through the thin metal roof and detonated inside. Pressure inside the enclosed space surged instantly. The hangar doors were blown open. A column of fire, 130 feet high, burst through the roof, lighting up the entire parking area in bright orange. The second drone struck the next hangar, where a Су-30 was undergoing maintenance. The explosion ignited auxiliary fuel, technical oil, and compressed gas cylinders positioned around the aircraft. Within seconds, the temperature inside the burning compartment exceeded 1800 degrees C. A chain of smaller explosions followed, throwing metal fragments and shattered glass dozens of meters away. Then the first secondary explosion occurred. The pressure wave swept across the parking area, shattering windows in nearby structures and forcing Russian soldiers to throw themselves flat on the ground. The AK-12 rifles that had just been firing wildly into the sky fell silent at once. At this point, the danger was no longer only in the air. It was exploding inside the base itself. The next FP-02 slammed into the central and western hangar rows. One hit the front entrance, one punched through the roof, one crashed near the taxiway, cracking the concrete and scattering metal fragments across the aircraft movement route. 1 minute, at least 7 hangars at Saki were hit. The flames now climbed higher than 200 feet. On thermal cameras, the hangar area no longer appeared as separate fire points. It had become one blazing white mass, where temperatures at the center of the fire could exceed 1000 degrees C. That was enough to soften aviation-grade aluminum, destroy wiring, burst aircraft tires, and turn cockpit electronics into scrap. Secondary explosions continued to flash inside the black smoke. Fuel trucks burned. Ground equipment was blown apart. Spare parts, depots, and maintenance areas were swallowed by the fire. The hangars that once protected Су-30 SMs, Су-30s, and Су-24s had now become giant furnaces in the middle of the airfield. Saki was not just attacked, it was paralyzed. Ukraine did not need to flatten the entire base. They only needed to strike the exact places that made aircraft unable to take off, prevented technical crews from working, and kept the Russian squadron, newly sent to Crimea, from joining the fight in time. If you support Ukraine's effort to restore peace as soon as possible, leave a comment below. In your opinion, what should the next target be? Air defense systems, fuel depots, or the military airfields reinforcing Crimea?